Mateo County. So, and our guest speaker will be Dr. Carolyn Jefferson Jenkins, a past president of the National League of Women Voters. That will be via Zoom, so you can attend from wherever you may be, and we would love to see you there. I will say, I can see that I missed this earlier. The time on the slide is not correct. It's 10 to noon rather than 12 to 1:30. So, but there's more information on our website. And now I'd like to turn the controls over to Petra Silton, Director of Advocacy and Education for Thrive Alliance, for some additional events.
Hi, on behalf of Thrive, welcome. We're so happy to see so many people here. We know this is a really important topic. We want to thank the League of Women Voters for partnering with us on this, and also want to thank you all for coming. So I wanted to give you a little bit of information about Thrive, because I know many of you are not familiar with us. So Thrive is a robust network of nonprofits, foundations, businesses, and community leaders with a shared commitment to strengthen San Mateo County. You do this by strengthening people, strengthening organizations, and strengthening communities through cross-sector collaboration, policy and advocacy, and capacity building. I'd like to tell you a little bit about a few events that we have coming up. We co-chair the Voter Education and Outreach Advisory Committee. And that is a committee that meets monthly with the county office as well as San Francisco Peninsula People Power. And it's something that's open to everyone. So if you're concerned about voter outreach, which I know the League often is, you are welcome to come to those meetings. Our next one is tomorrow. For executive directors and CEOs of nonprofits, we have quarterly leadership circle luncheons. And the next one's going to be on nonprofit employment laws and COVID. That is also tomorrow. And we invite you to that. We're also going to have a discussion that is open to everyone that we're doing in conjunction with Peninsula Family Service about policing in San Mateo. We're going to be discussing the data, what kind of racial disparities we have, and what the impact that is for our community. We have the sheriff of San Mateo County. We have the police chief of the city of San Mateo. It's going to be moderated by Melissa Natan-Jones, who is the executive director of the Peninsula Conflict Resolution Center. We have some community members who will be on the panel as well. We look forward to seeing you at that. And the very last one is our super fun, second to last one is our collective climate goals. So we have an Environment and Sustainability Action Group that meets monthly. And we're going to be meeting in December to talk about how to harness the power of all of the different environmental organizations that are working in San Mateo County towards collective action. And the last one is the one that's going to be the most fun, which is our holiday mix and mingle. It's game night with your legislative aides. So this will be on Zoom. Unfortunately, it's an annual tradition because we realize that getting to know your legislative aides is one of the best ways to create change in the county. So we host this social event and you guys are all welcome to come. I hope you can join us. So with that, I wanted to just briefly mention why Thrive is here, because Thrive as an organization supports housing as a policy. It's our mission to support the nonprofit sector and the people who are most disadvantaged. And if you don't have housing, that's kind of the first step towards being in a healthy community. And with the current housing crisis, middle and lower income people are really having a hard time are having a hard time living in San Mateo County. I'm sure you all know stories of people who can't live in the county they work in, or in the county they grew up in, or in the county they really want to be in. So we thought that it was really important to address this topic. And specifically, there are many different ways to address it. And one of them is through policy change. And lately, there has been a lot of policy change. There's been a lot of legislation that's happened. And we wanted to make sure that everybody understood what the legislation entails and how it's going to affect us. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Margaret, who's going to explain why the League of Women Voters and how they took positions specifically on the bills that we will be discussing next.
Thank you, Petra. I I especially want to thank all of you who are participating today. As you know, housing can be a difficult and often contentious topic in our community as housing affordability and availability compete with issues such as local control, land use policies, and historic neighborhood density. So let me briefly share how the League of Women Voters approaches these issues. The League is a nonpartisan political organization. We are nonpartisan in that we never support any party or candidate, but we do take positions on issues. The League takes its positions after extensive study, ensuring that our positions will be based on facts that will address our community's long-term interests and will avoid, in as much as possible, unintended negative consequences. Housing has therefore been a focus for our League for some time. I was reading just this morning that of the country's 100 most expensive zip codes in the year 2021, 70% are in California. The city of Atherton, which is part of our League's area of South and Central San Mateo County, it's in South San Mateo County. The city of Atherton is the most expensive zip code in the country for the 5th year in a row. So none of us in this area are strangers to the housing pressures. As property values have risen in our county, we have begun to see a number of negative impacts on our communities, including longer commute times, increased social stratification, homelessness and housing insecurity, and other negative effects. The League of Women Voters of California, our state league, has written to Governor Gavin Newsom in support of 2 bills that attempt to remedy our housing needs. Those bills are SB9, Atkins, Housing Development Approvals, and SB10, Wiener. SB9 would ease some of the barriers to building smaller homes by streamlining approval of single-family lot splits, as well as allowing 2 units on these newly created lots. This bill promotes small-scale neighborhood development by allowing up to 4 units of housing on lots zoned as single-family. This bill builds upon recent changes to accessory dwelling units, the so-called ADU law, supported by the League, which allow 3 units on a single-family parcel. At the request of the property owner, the local jurisdiction must allow all lots of at least 2,400 square feet to be split into 2 approximately equal lots by ministerial action. There could be a 40%, 60% split, but neither lot could be smaller than 1,200 square feet. California's housing crisis is fueled by restrictive zoning, as over 70% of our state is zoned as single-family residential. We currently have a statewide housing shortage of approximately 3.5 million homes. Home ownership in California is at its lowest rate since World War II. More and more often, home buying is becoming a privilege only available to the wealthiest. In most major California cities, fewer than 42% of households earn enough to purchase even the typical entry-level home. As a result, many renters will have little or no option to enter the housing market and begin to build equity. And so this problem has a disproportionate impact on Black and Latino households as well. So the type of missing middle housing, or the medium density housing, that this bill is trying to encourage is appropriate for renters or first-time home buyers. The new housing must comply with local objective design standards unless the standards would physically preclude either of the 2 units from being at least 800 square feet in area. So it should fit into existing neighborhoods. In addition, there are significant renter protections against displacement, and short-term rentals are prohibited in these new developments. Turning to SB10, this bill would provide affordable homes to more Californians by easing some of the barriers to building small multifamily developments. California's housing crisis and our residents' historic rent burden is fueled by restrictive zoning and preferred treatment of single-family homes. California has enjoyed explosive population growth, yet our approach to housing has not kept pace. The scarcity of the 3.5 million homes in California feeds poverty, homelessness, and sprawl, and erodes the stability of the middle class. And again, as with the bill I spoke about first, this one is attempting to address the missing middle housing or medium density housing near jobs and transit. This sort of missing middle or medium density housing is currently banned in over 70% of California. Our housing crisis worsens each year, and increasingly lower income workers cannot afford housing close to their jobs, creating more and more greenhouse gas emissions as they commute longer distance. SB10 allows cities to adopt resolutions to rezone neighborhoods for increased density of up to 10 homes per parcel in transit-rich areas and urban infill sites. This provides cities with a new tool to rezone for gentle middle-income density in a streamlined, expedited way, as the rezoning ordinances are not subject to CEQA. Currently, this type of rezoning can take years and face lawsuits, costing significant taxpayer funds. The legislation does not change local height limits, setbacks, and objective design standards. When the local jurisdiction passes such a resolution, it can choose whether the particular project will be ministerial by right or subject to discretionary approval. SB10 retains local control, as this bill simply authorizes local governments to rezone neighborhoods, but does not require this rezoning. Its main effect is to allow these projects to bypass the Environmental Quality Act, thereby saving time and allowing projects to be completed faster. For these reasons, the League of Women Voters strongly supports Senate Bills 9 and 10 as an important step toward addressing the missing middle problem and ameliorating California's housing crisis. And we have requested respectfully Governor Newsom to sign these two bills. So I know that's quite a chunk of information, but I hope that this helps to explain the League's positions, how we believe that this protects the things that we value in our communities, and has been taken with a great deal of thought and study to avoid some of the unintended consequences for various constituencies. So as I'm sure you are, I'm very eager to hear from our speakers and panelists today. So with that, I will turn the program back over to Petra to introduce our speakers.
Hi, so before I introduce our speakers, I would love for everyone to introduce themselves. So if you could just put in the chat, because we don't have time to go around the room, even though we would love to, put in your name, what city you're currently in, or unincorporated if that's the case. And please let us know what your favorite Thanksgiving side dish is. Now, I hope everybody was listening carefully. I said side dish, not dessert, because I know that everybody likes pumpkin pie and apple pie. I want to know what your side dish is. I'm just looking for ideas for my Thanksgiving. So we're actually going to do a quick poll now, again, just to get a better idea of who's in the room. So Yahaira Ortega, who I didn't introduce yet, and that's an oversight on my part. She's the Policy and Advocacy Associate for Thrive, and she's doing all of the back end work. So she's going to pull up a poll so that we can find out a little bit more about you and who is here. So it's just 2 questions. How long have you been living in San Mateo County? And we do have the option of I'm not living in San Mateo County. And the other one is, what type of home do you live in? Multifamily, single family? So as the poll is going and you are introducing yourselves, I'm going to let that go for a minute and then let you know what the flow of the day is. So first we're going to have Michael Lane is going to be our keynote speaker, and I will introduce him in just a moment. And then we'll have a moderated panel with Irving Torres and Leora Tanwatko. Then we'll do question and answer. So for the question and answer period, please just put your questions in chat. We're doing this in not in a webinar format because we want to be able to make it a little more conversational. If you put your questions in the chat, we'll actually make sure to get them to the panelists. Okay, looks like things aren't moving so much anymore. So wow, a lot of people have lived here more than 10 years. That's fascinating. And a lot of people in this group are single family homeowners. Okay. Thank you so much for sharing the information for us. Really appreciate that. Okay, so now introduction to our speakers. We are very grateful to have today Michael Lane, who's the State Policy Director for SPUR. He has an extensive background in management, housing development, local government, public policy, legislation, a whole bunch of things. Prior to joining SPUR, he worked at OffHome, the nonprofit housing association of Northern California, self-help enterprises. He also served as president of the board of the directors for Housing Leadership Council of San Mateo County and was a member of the advisory committee for the state of California's 2014 Housing Affordability Cost Study. He also served on the board of directors of Housing California and the board of governors of the California Housing Consortium. Sorry. And Michael will be giving our keynote address. After that, we have Leora Tanwatko Ross, who's the Associate Director of Housing Leadership Council, and many of you know her. She joined the Housing Leadership Council team in 2016 and manages campaigns and staff members as the Associate Director. Prior to joining HLC, she was a consultant for community outreach, and she's also been active with a number of organizations associated with land use and policy. She serves on the National Board of YIMBY Action and is a current president of the Peninsula Democratic Coalition. And our last panelist is Irving Torres, who is, just a quick commercial, also a board member for Thrive, but he's also the director of community engagement for OffHome. He serves on Housing Leadership Council Policy Committee, and prior to joining OffHome, Irving served as a senior legislative aide to San Mateo County Supervisor Warren Slocum, focusing on housing and land use issues. During his time as a senior legislative aide, he worked with constituents in the 4th District and helped to connect them to housing programs and services. So again, we have an amazing panel, and we will start with Michael Lane. So thank you all for coming again.
Well, great. Thank you very much. And good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to be here with you. I want to express my gratitude to both Thrive and the League, and really acknowledge your commitment to civic engagement and spirited support of enlightened public policy. So thank you. It's also a real privilege to be here with Leora and Irving. I admire their organizations and the work they do very much, and look forward to hearing from them as well. SPUR is over 100 years old, public policy think tank here in the Bay Area with offices in San Francisco, Oakland, and San Jose, but also work at the regional and state levels as well. We recently released our regional strategy, which is an ambitious set of reports in 7 different policy areas about how we grow over the next 50 years in the Bay Area while creating a sustainable, equitable, and prosperous region. So I'd encourage you, if you have an opportunity, to go to spur.org and see those documents that comprise our regional strategy. Today, of course, we'll only be speaking about housing, but there are lots of other policy briefs that are included in that regional strategy, including for transportation, renewable energy, water conservation, economic justice, et cetera. So I encourage you to do that at spur.org. And as I talk through my slides here today, or share my screen, I'll also provide links in the chat for you if you'd like to follow up with some of the website references that I include. But I'll go ahead and share my screen now to kick this off. So at spur.org, one of the policy briefs that's part of our regional strategy is this document, what it will really take to create an affordable Bay Area. And in terms of the context here, of course, this first graph here just shows the decline in housing permits over the past 40 years or so, really. And you can see both in single family and multifamily, what's led in part to the crisis that we have in terms of housing affordability and availability. And of course, playing into that is what we call the jobs to housing ratio. And you can see here, as I just scroll down here, what it was from 2004 to 2008. And of course, we had the Great Recession, which for the most part had halted new construction. But at that time, for example, San Mateo County, 0.91 jobs to housing ratio. And then of course, as we came out of the Great Recession, there was a tremendous surge in economic development, job creation, obviously led by the innovation sector, tech companies, and which really exacerbated that jobs to housing ratio that we had. In some cases, it was already challenging prior to, but it actually over the past decade has gotten much worse, and particularly as there are so many people wanting to move in and to take those jobs, and then trying to find the available housing for them. It's forced a lot of course, of our lower income workers out of the region, either forced to come back in with super commutes or to leave the region altogether. And as a result, I just wanted to show one more slide here on this next page here. In terms of income inequality, and what's happened is that over that time, over the past 20 years, we've actually had a decrease of 300,000 households making less than $100,000 a year, and an increase of 625,000 households making more than 100,000. So you can see how those demographics have substantially changed, directly related to the job creation and the lack of affordable housing. It also has tremendous impacts, of course, on our local school districts and student enrollments, as lower income families and just middle income families too, with young children, are unable to really live here, and they move out. And of course, that's also for some districts to actually close schools as a result. So that's a significant challenge. The introduction was excellent in terms of outlining how we got here, what the need was, what we were trying to address in terms of Senate Bill SB9 and 10, but some additional context in terms of what we call the missing middle. I'll just stop sharing my screen for now, although I want to share later some additional information. The issue really is that the San Francisco Bay Area is one of the most expensive places in the world actually to create housing. In terms of cost per unit, and the types of housing that we build are, of course, the most expensive, and that's what's allowed and permitted through our land use and zoning policies. Steel and construction, steel and concrete construction of towers, apartment towers, is the most expensive type of housing that you can actually build, and that we tend to do that in our downtowns, of course, and along commercial corridors. And then, of course, single family housing, as we know, detached single family homes are also very expensive in the Bay Area, with a median price of $1.2 million in the entire Bay Area, of course, more than double that on the peninsula. But even statewide now, the median home price is now exceeds $800,000. So also that is inaccessible for many families, many working families. And it was, as was stated in the introduction, over 3/4 of all of our land is actually zoned for single family homes, that very expensive building type. Or when we do allow apartments, it tends to be in the downtown areas, and at that type of construction, what we call type 1 Class A, those are very expensive rents, and typically $3,000 to $4,000 a month in many of our jurisdictions like San Francisco and San Jose. So out of reach. And so that's why the discussion of missing middle housing has come back around. This is actually a building type that we used to produce, really, particularly prior to World War II, where you'd see more duplexes and triplexes and quads. I now live in San Jose, but as a longtime resident of the peninsula, over a couple decades on the peninsula as well. And in many of these neighborhoods, the older neighborhoods, you do actually see duplexes and triplexes and sometimes quads as well, mixed in along with single family homes. But what really happened is, particularly after World War II, we moved to more of the tract homes and subdivisions that were exclusively single family, and where other types of of buildings and densities were simply not allowed. And that was the way that we tended to grow in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Or down zonings would take place, and there were limits on the types of housing that could be built. And there's, quite frankly, lots of sprawl developments with those types of subdivisions. So the idea with the legislature has begun to move on is that we need to create a new baseline that really gets us back to what we call smart growth and infill development, but also has been called the new urbanism, which is really the old urbanism, but it came back around in the 1990s. This idea that would be more compact development, but on a human scale, but also creates more opportunities for more affordable home ownership opportunities and for rentals in those places, particularly along the coast and near job centers where there is such demand to live, and where we need to provide more housing in an affordable way. We would also say that the duplexes really blend in, I think, well in existing neighborhoods, and even much more so than some of the tear downs that we see and the mansion rebuilds that actually disrupt neighborhood character much more. And we're seeing a movement that way because that's what has been prior to the passage of these bills. That's what's been legal to do. I would also say that the duplexes and triplex opportunities now, this is really not the business model for corporate real estate investors. There was some concern that real estate investors would come in and create duplexes and create rentals. But as we'll talk about more later, SB9 also has a owner occupancy requirement to help prevent that. Plus, typically what you see, to the extent that there are investments in single family homes from investors, it tends to be just fixer uppers and then flipping them or then renting them, but not actually tearing buildings down and then taking months to bring the workforce in to then create additional rental use. That's really just not the business model in that sector. California, I think, was also challenged in a sense to move in this direction because of the enlightened moves that have been made, for example, in jurisdictions like Minneapolis, Oregon, and Portland, which were the first ones to move away from exclusive single family zoning only and to allow for some of these other building types and what we do call gentle density or elegant density as another term. This also does create greater affordability by design and more opportunities. SB9, for example, does not override HOA law. And what I'm going to do now is just share my screen for another resource for you. Holland and Knight put out this brief, and I can provide the link for you too, but it really goes through a lot of the provisions in the bill. It really shows how it was narrowly tailored, and it does really intend to address concerns about neighborhood character, attractive design standards, and making sure that owner occupancy is a priority, that we're not building, for example, on prime farmland or in wetlands or in fire zones, for example. And then one of the key provisions, which had been controversial in most part because it was misunderstanding of what the bill says, but if you use both the duplex option and the lot split options, then you're not able to then also add ADUs or JADUs. The jurisdiction is not required to allow for that. So I thought this write-up by Holland and Knight is very helpful to go through all those provisions of the bill just to make sure that people are clear exactly what's in the bill. And for example, if renters are in the structure, then you're not allowed to use this bill as well. So it's really at the discretion of the homeowner within these parameters. And then of course for SB10, as had been previously mentioned, that's really the local city council who would make that decision on where and even if to use that to upzone for smaller neighborhood multifamily buildings of up to 10 dwelling units. Oops, I wanted to share one more document with you. Let me just see here. And one more resource. That's not working. Let's see. Okay, there we go. And so the Turner Center also did an analysis of just what the viability of SB9 and what the uptake would likely be. And what they determined is only about 5% of all single family parcels would have both the physical capacity and financial feasibility and the willingness of a property owner to be able to utilize this. So it's a relatively modest bill, but it helps as part of the solution. In addition to where we need greater density, obviously near transit and job centers, we do need to have some additional density in our single family neighborhood, just because they're the vast majority of what the residential land that is zoned for. And if you go through this document, there actually can break down by county and then in the jurisdictions in which you live, if you wanted to see what the likelihood of uptake in terms of feasibility and viability of duplexes are in your jurisdiction. But for San Mateo County in general, across the board, it's only about 5% of total single family parcels or less than 7,000 lots across the entire county. And so while it'll be a marginal improvement, it's not going to make, it's not certainly radical in any way. And I think it is designed so that these new units that do come online will blend in very well with neighborhood character. And so that's why I think it did meet with the approval of the legislature and the governor, and it'll take obviously many years in terms of the ability of homeowners to be able to finance a duplex and their decision to do that, and then to have the workforce that would be willing to build these types of smaller projects. We'll have to develop those kind of the general contractors again, who will want to do that type of work in similar way that the ADU sort of space was created in terms of a new opportunity, because we actually we scaled that and made it easier for homeowners to add ADUs. And it'll take time also for bills like SB9 and 10 to actually produce results. And to the extent that they do, it's necessary, but not sufficient in terms of really meeting our housing needs in the Bay Area. So I will stop there and stop sharing now, and then turn it over to Leora for her presentation.
All right, thanks, Michael. What a day to be in San Mateo County, huh? Okay, so I need to check with you, Hyra, about, are you sharing my slides or am I? Wonderful, thank you. Hi, everybody. So glad to be here. I'm with the Housing Leadership Council. Our mission is to work with communities and their leaders to create and preserve quality, affordable homes in San Mateo County. We also support policies that increase the land, money, and political will for affordable housing in San Mateo County. Even though I'm going to talk a little bit about state legislation today, I do want to note that we mostly focus on local legislation and policies. But I did my homework, so I get to be here with Michael talking about this. Next slide, please. So this is a graphic that we use to talk more about basically like how far below the rent, the fair market rent that some folks are in San Mateo County. This graph is based on the rent only being 30% of your income. So if you see the person on disability, $287 is 30% of their monthly disability check. And as you can tell, it's absolutely not adequate for fair market rent, not even for a 0-bedroom studio here. And if you want to be able to only spend 30% of your income on a market rate 2-bedroom house or apartment, then you need to have like 2 white-collar salaries, as you can see on the right-hand side. So this is what we use to talk about why we need to have deeply affordable homes, basically for people with special needs and for people who can't, who don't have 2 white-collar incomes in their household. Next slide. I need to give credit to Sustainable San Mateo County for this story. This was part of their report this year, which focused on the jobs housing imbalance. I wanted to bring this conversation back to the people who we're talking about. So you can read about Estella and her family. These are her 3 kids. Her oldest son is 24 and he works at Costco, and they live in Redwood City. And it's a common story around here children living with their family well beyond the age of 18. I lived with my husband's family until last year, so I was 33. And when I gave this presentation to my colleagues at HLC, there were 3 staff people who live with their parents who don't necessarily want to, but it's kind of the name of the game around here. It's not unusual for adult children to live at home. So this is a wonderful story. Thanks again to Sustainable San Mateo County for really putting faces to this issue, and talking about who these people are and how they fit into our community and why we need to do something to make sure that they can stay. Next slide, please. So Michael sort of talked about these numbers a little bit, and this number is from the census in 2015. But I did want to note that there are some cities that are, I guess one city in San Mateo County, Redwood City, who has written a commercial linkage fee, which applies to new office construction, that incentivizes those office developers to also build deeply affordable housing as part of their proposals. I also wanted to note that David Crabb, who's on this call, wrote an excellent op-ed in the San Mateo Daily Journal a couple of weeks ago talking about this very problem. And I think there has been some discussion of, what can we do to sort of discourage cities from building jobs? I don't know if you have been following along, but San Carlos built more biotech. Millbrae is actually talking about welcoming more biotech to their town, my hometown. And so I think at the Housing Leadership Council, we have talked about, we are in Silicon Valley. The ecosystem that has been created around jobs is kind of unstoppable. Like, we have not had any success in sort of convincing cities not to build jobs. And so for us, the path forward is to make sure that cities are requiring office developers to adequately mitigate the impact on affordable housing that they have. And I realize that might be a little bit controversial to say, but San Mateo County is a part of Silicon Valley, and we are a global job center. So we need to make sure that we build all the housing that we need to accommodate it. Next slide. Okay, so I have a very, very sort of cursory view of the state legislation that was passed in September. So 31 new housing bills were signed. I promise that I will not go through all of these housing bills one by one, but I want to give an overview. So for all of these bills fit into 4 areas. Some of them streamlining the building of new homes. So this is like SB9 and SB10, where they're incentivizing, duplexes, granny units, things that would not have been possible before in terms of zoning. The second one is breaking down barriers to build more affordable housing. This, in our minds, is like 100% affordable housing, making sure that there's funding for those things, and other fixes to make sure that it's easier to build. Addressing racism by elevating fair housing principles. This is mostly done through affirmatively furthering fair housing, which cities are required to do through their housing element. Yes, Michael, thank you for linking the article that I just copied all of these points from. And also thank you for writing that article. So yes, cities, all the cities right now are required to affirmatively further fair housing through their housing element. And that's super wonky, but I will share a link where you can sign up to learn more about the housing element from HLC. And then the last one, which could be a little bit controversial, is holding local governments accountable to follow the laws that the state have set out for their land use decisions. And I know that there is a healthy conversation right now about local control and state interventions. And I think we're going to find that balance. Next slide, please. I wanted to just talk a little bit about the budget too. I know Irving is going to really dig into these numbers and what they mean, especially about the new homes and exiting from homelessness. But there was an unprecedented number of dollars allocated to housing by the governor this year, including $100 million for granny flats, or as we call them, ADUs. For low to moderate income homeowners, and then $800 million in that 100% affordable housing. That's generally by transit and in job-rich areas. So that is the end of my presentation. Irving, I will kick it over to you.
Thanks, Leora. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Irving Torres. I'm the Director of Community Engagement with OffHome. Next slide. So I just, actually previous slide. So I just want to give a kind of a brief overview of our organization. We're a fairly new organization that was launched in December of 2019. And we focus on three things. One is to disrupt the cycles of homelessness and poverty. Two is to redress the disparities as a result of race. And then three is to support and create economic mobility opportunities, but really importantly, to stabilize and support our extremely low income. So next slide. So I want to kind of just talk more deeply about the extremely low income households, otherwise known as ELI in San Mateo County. As you can see in the chart, the number of ELI renter households that comprise the county is 18,000. And this is information that was taken from the census back in 2019. So obviously this was pre-pandemic numbers, but the numbers are definitely different now. And the ELI population make up more than 10% of the county. Many of these individuals are essential workers. They're caregivers, cleaners, cooks, and the ELI population are more likely to be Black, Latinx, Hispanic, Indigenous, and Asian. And so we're focused on them here at OffHome because they are the individuals in the population who are most highest risk of homelessness. 72%, and this is information taken from a needs report conducted by the California Housing Partnership, that 72% of the extremely low income households are paying more than half of their income on housing costs. And so how we define, or how it's defined, extremely low income are individuals who make up less than 30% of the area median income. And so in San Mateo County, that individual, their income is roughly or almost about $38,000. And so these are individuals in a population that are most likely housing insecure and who could be most highest at risk. And so that's the reason why our organization, and you can move to the next slide, here at OffHome has been supporting and sending letters of support on these bills. And the significance of it, because the housing production is part of the solution towards tackling homelessness. These bills are part of improving housing, and obviously, as mentioned before by Leora and Michael and others, in terms of just, we are having kind of like a huge supply/demand mismatch here in the Bay Area. And that's due to, decades of underbuilding, barriers, to build affordable housing. And so, for the focus and the results and the impacts of these housing bills that Governor Newsom just slide, it is an incremental and an important step that we need to take to not only build more housing and also provide more supply that relieves the pressure in our housing system. But, we believe here at OffHome that this happens at all levels of affordability. Obviously building more affordable housing, especially for individuals with extremely low income, it's going to help directly towards preventing and reducing homelessness by creating more of this housing security for our ELI population community. And so as Leora mentioned, there was some significant kind of investments through the budget in terms of housing and homelessness. and significant. The budget builds on the investments through a comprehensive approach towards housing and services, also across the range of homelessness interventions. And some of those that was invested as a result, or that was mentioned in the budget that's going to go towards these investments, is the expansion of access to affordable housing, as well as to provide additional resources to home key acquisition. And so I just want to talk a little bit about the importance of Project Home Key. It's a state level program that provides funds to purchase and rehabilitate hotels and motels and convert them into permanent long-term housing for people who are experiencing homelessness. Our focus of disrupting the cycle of homelessness stems from really stabilizing, our folks and preventing them from becoming homeless. And so that's one of the reasons why we were supportive of the bills of SB9 and 10. And Project Home Key continues to, be a strong, local demand. There's been a strong local demand for more home key, funding, given the advantage of acquiring and utilizing additional permanent housing units at a fraction of the time and cost of traditional permanent housing. And so while, these bills that have been signed, as I mentioned, are going to make those incremental yet important progress to build more affordable housing, these bills are going to be part of what's going to take towards reducing homelessness, not just here in San Mateo County, but also throughout the Bay Area. It's one of the many reasons why we fought for them at the state legislature and sending letters of support on these many housing bills that have been signed by the governor. And lastly, just want to emphasize that our approach, towards reducing homelessness is this regional action plan that was comprised or developed by our regional impact council that comprised of a range of different sectors. And so the importance of this and why it's connected to the importance of the bills that were signed was because there's a framework that talks about making investments towards simultaneous investments towards interim housing, permanent and supportive housing, and homelessness prevention. And so tackling this issue of homelessness and really supporting our ELI, it's going to take these simultaneous investments or simultaneous improvements. And that includes that production of housing. And so that's why, these bills were definitely important as a component towards, tackling this goal here in the region. And so that pretty much kind of concludes my presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Laura and Irving, for your presentations. Laura, you had mentioned the commercial linkage fee as a best practice and Redwood City as a real highlight. And Irving, you had mentioned Project Home Key and the impact that that's having. Could both of you then also talk about other best practices or policies or good news stories at the local level where jurisdictions are doing the right thing, and maybe that should be replicated in other places in terms of housing affordability and then also addressing homelessness? Start with Leora.
Yeah, I think the best thing San Mateo County did was in 2016 passing Measure K and really having funds for affordable housing. Something that we are also focused on is working with other cities to find other revenue streams for affordable housing at the city level and not just the county level. So I would say that's a priority for HLC and something that we want to see all cities do.
And then I will just say that, specifically for San Mateo County, they adopted our regional action plan, and the significance behind that is that, we're gathering all the other counties to come together. And the benefit from that is really sharing best practices, right? What our other jurisdictions are doing towards these potential revenues and funds that are coming down, not just at the state level, but at the federal level. And what can we do to make sure that, each of these local jurisdictions are receiving those funds to build, more housing or provide more services for the homelessness population and communities as a whole. And then I would also say that the benefit of being part of it is also learning about the different policies are out there here in the Bay Area. And so there's, a lot of projects, how they're using Project Home Key for not just the permanent housing, but also the interim housing as well. So really sharing those best practices about the flexibility that some of these funding could be given. And, not just specifically in housing as well, other, department funding that's coming down from the state level can be also redirected towards housing as well. And so the benefit is really just learning from these different jurisdictions of how they're applying their funds and how they're applying the policies to maximize kind of the benefits of the communities as a whole.
Great. And Leora, you had put a link in the chat here about housing element advocacy and work. Could you talk a little bit about what you're doing there?
How much time do I have? Housing element happens once every 8 years. It's like a 400-page document that every city has to submit to the state at HCD. And there's a lot of different things that go into it, but what we are focusing on is the section called policies and programs, which is basically like planting a seed for future ordinances that a city could pass. So in a housing element, they'll say, we want to study increased tenant protections and we will do so by 2025 or something like that. And the housing element is different because it requires that the cities do an update every single year. So if they say they're going to do something, they have to update the public on the status of that thing every single year. So we are trying to leverage that whole process, which has been kind of overhauled by the state recently, adding all these new regulations, all these new teeth to help the cities along as they plan for this sort of unprecedented number that they were assigned by the state in terms of housing units. So that's a couple-year project for HLC, but it's fascinating and really worthwhile. I would say it's the best tool that we have to build affordable housing.
And Irving, what are the policy priorities right now that OffHome's working on?
Yeah, making sure that, when there is funding for like interim housing or any type of housing, that there's these wraparound services, right? And so I know that's kind of a different type of discussion, but I think it just goes towards the importance of really supporting our extremely low income. And we just don't mean like just, services, but, the common kind of, I guess, typical services that people perceive about like, getting some like support, whether it's through health, but also like innovative approaches about like services that builds that economic mobility, right? And so it's really looking at kind of policies, maybe at the state and federal level, what's keeping folks, grounded and not like moving on up, because, part of the issue is really just trying to stabilize folks, right? Instead of becoming homeless. There's a statistic, I don't know if the statistic is true here in San Mateo County, but in Alameda County as an example, in Santa Clara County, for every one individual that's sheltered in place, 2 or 3 more folks are off the street. And that just goes back to, what we all said about the high cost, living here in the Bay Area. And so it's an issue that we're just also focusing on here at OffHome.
Great, thank you both very much. I'll turn it back over to Petra in terms of the Q&A session now.
Great, we have some really good questions coming up. I'll start with the first one, which is, I think it's Linda Jansen who said, I've heard that homes cost cities more for fire and police, et cetera, and offices provide tax dollars. And maybe that's one of the reasons why not as much housing is being built while a lot of offices are being built. So I'd love it if somebody could comment on that.
Sure, I can take that one. I think obviously, Proposition 13 is going to be at the core of our discussion, but prior to Proposition 13, actually a way to generate revenues and population was to do the sprawl subdivisions. And of course, that was sort of the history of the city of San Jose, for example, because in the 60s and 70s, that was a growth model where you could generate revenues from new property tax, and those could be increased at the local level. It also creates great uncertainty, though, particularly for seniors who are on fixed incomes to then have their property tax jacked up by either the school board or the local city council, and created some hardships there. And so that was general push behind the adoption of Proposition 13, which limits property taxes to 1% of the assessed value, and it can only increase by 2% per year after that. And so over time, obviously, the cost of fire and police and other kinds of essential services continued to grow, and those revenues did not grow commensurate with the increased costs. And so it did create burdens on local governments, particularly to provide that infrastructure and those essential services to existing residents. And so for new residents, though, of course, when they move in, that new assessment was much higher, and so they were paying higher property taxes. So to an extent, property taxes are not generating those revenues that local jurisdictions need. On the other hand, if you do build higher densities, there's another reason to do that. It also makes fiscal sense, because once you get to about 30 or 40 dwelling units per acre, higher density housing actually does not only pay its own way, it can actually generate additional revenues because you have more residents living in a smaller amount of space, and those services can be provided without, sort of sprawling out, where it takes longer time and you have to build more fire stations and police stations to cover a larger area, as we used in our previous growth patterns. So that's really, I think, infill development also makes fiscal sense for jurisdictions to help right the ship in terms of their fiscal situation.
And I'm actually going to go back and just remind everyone that not everyone on the call is a housing expert or necessarily a local politics expert. So either Leora or Irving, can you talk to us, just explain what Measure K is, because you just glossed right over that. So let people know what's going on in the county and what Measure K is.
I'm sorry, Petra. Measure K is a 1/2-cent sales tax that was an extension of Measure A, I believe. And now all of those funds that we pay every time we buy something in San Mateo County go to a variety of services. And every year, the biggest allocation of that money is for new affordable housing. Thank you, Petra, for reminding me.
And for the audience, please continue to ask questions.
And I would just say on that real quickly, Measure K we were thrilled to have the support of the community to pass that, and I'd also participated in that campaign. It got 70% of the vote, and it was an extension of an existing 1/2-cent sales tax for an additional 20 years. And as Laura said, it's really been critical to have that local funding to then be able to draw down state and federal resources to build the affordable housing that we need. So thank you to San Mateo County voters.
It's great. That's one of the reasons I wanted to kind of lift it up, because it is unique to San Mateo County that we're putting so much into this, and that's kudos to San Mateo County for that. But a great other question, which is that these bills that you've talked about really are limited in scope and they take time, as Michael pointed out. So what else is coming down the pike? What can we expect that can also help with housing needs?
So I can certainly start on that. I think to Leora's point, the housing element is just a huge deal, because it only comes around every 8 years. And because of recent legislation, we're actually more closely aligned with what the actual need for housing is than we've ever been in terms of housing element law and jurisdictions having to actually zone for that. Otherwise, there's, as you've mentioned, there may be relatively little incentive for a jurisdiction to actually zone for residential development, because other uses would be much more lucrative and they would have to provide fewer services. The classic examples, of course, being transit occupancy tax, transit occupancy tax for hotel tax, basically, where you have visitors come in, participate in events, go to restaurants and spend money and then leave, and you don't have to provide services for them. So, those are the kinds of uses historically that have been more attractive to local jurisdictions. But the housing element is actually the only element of the general plan, 7 elements for planning for local jurisdictions that actually has to be certified by the state. And so that's because of that, the lack of incentive necessarily or desire on the part of jurisdiction necessarily to zone for the necessary housing, that was adopted. And so it's been on the books for decades now, housing element law. As we say, we're now in our 6th cycle of the regional housing needs allocation over that period of time. So more than 30 years. And the reason this is so critical is, so the zoning is the starting point. You need the land, but you need properly zoned sites to be able to build affordable housing. And so to be able to do that through this process and then have HCD certify your housing element is that key first step, where then you can then bring in the resources for affordable housing, and then you can get the project approvals that are streamlined. And those are really the three areas that we typically work on in terms of the state budget, state housing policies, and regulations. And so we're really excited about this this upcoming housing element process, and grateful for HLC and others who are advocates at the local level to make sure that those are really viable sites that are being brought forward, and that we can really see housing production take off from there. But I'll stop there and see if Leo or Irving want to weigh in as well.
I'll just add, Michael, that one of the focuses for our organization was, with the RHNA numbers, the regional housing needs allocation, it kind of clumps together like low income and extremely low income together. And so when the tracking gets reported out, it's all in one group. And our organization has been reaching out to the state asking if that tracking, or when the counties report back, that number could be divided to separate low income and to extremely low income, because I think with the extremely low income, through my presentation, it's a different group. And as I mentioned, they're the group that are more likely to be at risk of becoming homeless. And it's an educational thing for folks throughout the Bay Area to know, like, okay, what are the numbers that we need to build more units for that specific population, instead of clumping them together, which we wouldn't necessarily be able to see those numbers visibly. And so that's one of the efforts that we were trying to do at OffHome.
That's a great point. That's really critical, because as you mentioned, extremely low income and permanent supportive housing, they're very different housing types, and they need additional resources and ongoing services, et cetera. And so we really need to break that out and understand, what's being provided versus what the needs are. So that's a great point.
So we have a question about how is transit-rich and job centers defined?
So one way for job centers is really that jobs housing imbalance, as it were, in our case particularly, but also central business districts. There are true bedroom communities that really don't have much office or commercial space in general, but there are jurisdictions that actually have large office parks, for example. And obviously that's been a trend on the peninsula, where you've had these large campuses, tech campuses, for example, in relatively small towns, where the largest, tallest buildings prior to their arrival were 2 or 3 stories maybe. And so what we're trying to get at is where we are creating these jobs, and we can identify corporate campuses, industrial parks, central business districts, that we're also making sure that we're adding the housing that we need. And in terms of a robust transit service, we typically talk about peak commute times, and between 15 and 20-minute headways. That means every 15 or 20 minutes you can get a bus at a particular stop. So that's very robust transit service. Some areas in the peninsula have that, but obviously in San Francisco, there's even more coverage in terms of Muni and BART and the other options that people have, which has some of the highest and the most robust transit opportunities for transit-oriented development. The idea being, if we're going to invest billions of dollars in BART extensions and for Caltrain, and to keep our Samtrans and Muni, for example, thriving, that we need to be able to make those investments. Then we also need to bring in the housing, in addition to the jobs which jurisdictions are all competing for in terms of economic development opportunities.
Thank you. The next question is if there are any groups that have model ordinances that are being used for SB9 and SB10 implementation, any local model codes that would be helpful and more useful for our communities.
So that's in progress. I would say the bill was just signed into law. It actually takes place it'll take effect on January 1st. There are jurisdictions that have already jumped out ahead because they were already moving toward fourplexes, for example. So the city of Berkeley is a real leader in this space, as is the city of Sacramento. Unfortunately, some of our other jurisdictions in the Bay Area, not so much. And then obviously just larger cities are going to have more capacity, more staff to be able to work on this, to be able to implement. Similar to ADU laws, it will take time. I'm going to put a link in the chat, which is the California Department of Housing and Community Development created an ADU handbook, and they will also be providing guidance memos in the near future on implementation of SB9 and 10. And so as we get closer to that January 1st deadline, I think you're going to see more of these documents like HCDs, like the Holland and Knight document, which I'd shared with you, which really outline what the law says and how jurisdictions are to implement it.
Okay, I'm going to call you out again on the insider speak. Can you talk briefly about what an ADU is and what the recent law changes around ADUs are?
Yeah, so accessory dwelling units, Leora also mentioned, sometimes known as granny flats. Small buildings on the side of a single family lot, for example, but also we have what we call junior ADUs, which may be a room inside an existing building as well. And so over the past 5 or 6 years, there's been state laws that have been adopted to try to make them more user-friendly for a homeowner who wants to install an ADU, because although there were laws on the books for decades, jurisdictions would find ways, including requiring 20 or 30 foot setbacks, et cetera, or it was on a discretionary approval. So if you had neighbors opposing an ADU, then you just wouldn't be able to get the approval from your city. And so they actually created more opportunities for by right to build an ADU within limits in terms of setbacks and design conditions, et cetera, height limits and that kind of thing within the existing development box. But to make it simpler for a homeowner who wants to do that, now you still have to find ways to finance it. And to Leora's point, for lower income homeowners, there's an interest in the legislature to create loan products, for example, at CalHFA, the California Housing Finance Agency, for those who want to do that. And in some cases, in return for deed restricting those ADUs, they can get financing. There are even programs at the local level that allow for that if you're willing to rent to a lower income household. And so we've actually seen a real boom in ADUs since the implementation of those laws. And for example, in San Jose, I think it's over 40% of new development building permits were from ADUs, because that was the most the housing type that had the most uptake, given all the other problems in terms of permitting, but then also to construction costs that we've seen. And there are more companies now stepping into this space, based on these opportunities, and do prefabricated types of ADUs and try to bring down the cost so that more people can be able to access that opportunity if they're able to finance it.
Thank you. I'm going to just keep on that same theme, which is somebody asked, the teeny houses with built-in bathroom facilities seem like a great solution. Why are they so expensive to build when units can be purchased for well under 100,000?
Yes, so the tiny home model is actually one that actually is being used, and Habitat for Humanity has actually done some of this work for what we call bridge housing communities, for example, in the city of San Jose, where they've actually built smaller tiny homes with utilities. And I think it's well under $100,000 per unit. But that's been a way to provide an interim step to get people off the streets into the tiny homes, and then program them to be able to move into permanent supportive housing when enough of that housing is built and come online. But it's like an interim step. And so it is a model that works and is cost effective.
Thank you. So I think there are a couple of related questions. I'm going to pull them all together, which is just that there is this imbalance between building offices and building jobs, and that's clear. And that slide was pretty effective to see what a tremendous, 11-to-1 is a huge imbalance. Has there been pushback? I think Leora touched a little bit on this, but has been pushback in either having, not permitting as much of the of the office development, or even converting some of the office development into residential.
So internally, I think we have kind of talked about ways that you can make offices a little bit more difficult to build. And I think that there's kind of a good roadmap for that in terms of like all the ways that people have made housing more difficult to build. There's certainly some ideas there, but I think, as like that has been something that we have talked about, but officially, like, I think there is a discussion that we need to have these conversations regionally and make sure that and this is why the regional allocation numbers were so important, is to make sure that every city does their fair share of building housing, and that we don't have outliers, who are only building jobs and not building housing. But I will sort of be upfront that this is like just like, it's a struggle to, I think some of I guess I get the question every once in a while, is like, why doesn't HLC oppose office? And I think the basic answer is like, that's not our mission. Our mission is to build housing, right? So I think, that is something that we sort of struggle with. And I like welcome like ideas about this, but it's just kind of, I think we also want to recognize that we are part of this like regional job growth system. And so we need to make sure that that housing is talked about as part of the solution. And that's where we want to focus.
Another angle to this that I wanted to just bring up is really the shift to e-commerce had really taken place and had begun prior to the pandemic, but obviously has only picked up in terms of online shopping opportunities. And so for brick and mortar to survive, it's going to have to be as easy as possible for local residents to be able to go to those stores and buy what they need. And they're going to have to be close and walkable, et cetera. And so what we're seeing is a real interest in these kinds of mixed use developments to revitalize and renovate a lot of these larger shopping centers that can really no longer, thrive under that existing business model. And so that to the extent that they can bring people onto the sites who will use these restaurants and frequent these businesses, that's going to be a longer term trend that we're seeing. It's actually good for the fiscal bottom line for local jurisdictions as well, to revitalize these old shopping centers that oftentimes were mostly parking, 2/3 parking lots. As we begin to make those shifts, look for more opportunities like that, and jurisdictions will see it's in their own best interest to do so.
Leora mentioned the healthy discussion around local control versus state mandates. I think that's definitely something that is kind of on people's minds, because these two big bills that make a big change to locally were decided in Sacramento. So Leora, do you want to talk a little bit more about the state mandates versus local control?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think, sorry?
I said, you can say no, we can throw it over to someone else.
Yeah, I mean, I can pass on that. I think I shared everything that I have to share while I was talking.
Irving or Michael, do you want to?
Sure, I can talk about that. So a lot of the state preemption of local land use and zoning, or what we call home rule, has come about because, as we said, there's no incentive for local jurisdictions otherwise to zone and permit housing if they can simply try to attract as much office and commercial, and then actually have neighboring jurisdictions take on the burden of actually housing residents. So it's this perverse sort of incentive that's set up in the system of the way we do both taxation and then land use and zoning policy at the local level. So what the state has actually done is come in and they've declared an issue of statewide concern, and then that allows them to set some of the frameworks and some of the basics in terms of how much housing you have to plan for. And jurisdictions are not required to build the housing. That's important, but they need to at least provide the appropriate zoning to be able to provide that housing. And so that has caused some pushback under the guise of local control. People don't want the state to come in and tell jurisdictions they have to zone. But I think that's also the fact that we hadn't moved on this sooner has actually contributed to the high cost of housing and also the homelessness situation that we found. And that's really why the state has had, just even for basic health and safety and just to have a functioning society, you do need some basic level of housing to go along with all the jobs that are being created. And that's why there's a role for the state. Obviously, there are limits to what that role is, but that's why over the past several years, the state has moved in to create some baseline, like we do in other places. For example, in healthcare, for example, the state sets certain laws that hospitals have to follow, or education, that the local school boards and school districts have to follow. So there is some baseline. We didn't have that so much in the past until these recent laws have been passed. But of course, there are some local residents who are unhappy with that and want to try to overturn that.
Thank you. This one's for anyone, and I'm actually happy to answer it as well, which is to help understand why, this in the chat, why pro-housing advocates, especially YIMBYs and nonprofits, never address limiting jobs. We need transparency of who funds these organizations. Can links be provided to find out who are the major funders of these and other nonprofit organizations? So I think the question is, are any of your organizations being funded by corporations, and therefore that's not, and therefore we are not pushing back on more offices being constructed?
We actually have a broad base of funding support that comes just from some corporations, but also from members who want to be part of an urban public policy think tank and support our work. I would also say the other challenge, and I'm a former local elected official myself, jurisdictions that typically wanted to bring in jobs, and if you ran for city council, that was in many cases that's what you tried to do, to be able to have job opportunities, but also then to enhance the fiscal situation of a jurisdiction. And you would often compete to be a jobs friendly kind of a jurisdiction. And so that mindset typically is what happens at the local level, because that's how you actually are able to then fund other activities and amenities and art in your jurisdiction, is through having a strong and robust economic base. And so I don't know that I'm not in the business of opposing economic development, but I do think it needs to be balanced, and that housing needs to be a component of that. So our focus has been on not stopping jobs, but also trying to provide the housing that we need, because the reality is we live in one of the most beautiful places in the world with world-class universities and weather and all kinds of advantages in terms of access to markets around the world. And so there's always going to be a lot of interest and demand to bring jobs and for people to move to the Bay Area. And so the question is, are we going to provide the housing opportunities at all income levels for people to be able to recognize those desires that they have to live here and to work here?
Oh, and I think all of the nonprofit organizations are by law totally transparent, so you can look up who funds them at any time. Another question is there a master jobs housing balance list by city and not just by county, and which offices are in the pipeline? So I guess the question is, if we want to follow this, is there an easy way to do it?
No.
I think what you could do, if you go down to City Hall, I think you could talk to the economic directors there and get a sense of what their projections are for the amount of square feet that's going to come online, what that employment base looks like. And I think, to Leora's point, many more jurisdictions are now adopting these commercial linkage fees, where they're really taking into account the new jobs that are being the jobs and the housing requirements that are going along with those as they permit the new square footage in terms of office space. And so that is an important move to try to calibrate it better.
I want to add to, in Redwood City, there's an example of an office developer who's actually providing funds for preservation in addition to the funds that they're required to provide for production. So I think that there are some models there, like I said, Redwood Cities, that you really can use office developers to get things that you otherwise wouldn't be able to. Like, money for extremely low income preservation is hard to come by. But Redwood City is getting it from their office developers.
Okay. I'm going to do one last question and then we'll wrap it up. And if you have any last words, but, and this is just like, are there opportunities with any empty office buildings to convert it into residential? Is that something that is possible or might happen?
Yeah, that's called adaptive reuse, and it's more challenging to do and more expensive, so it's less likely to happen. But there are some times when you do have a unique building with good bones, as we say, where that could be appropriate and could work. But sometimes the uses are so different in just terms of the structures that you're working with, that's very hard to do that and very expensive.
Is it more expensive than building new housing, Michael?
Can be, because you have demolition, and it just depends. Yeah.
I think that's one of those things that our non-housing people look at. It's like, oh, all this just looks like space, but we don't think about how much it takes to convert.
And you have, seismic issues. If it's a really old building, there's all kinds of other issues that you can come, asbestos and, abatement and just all kinds of challenges that may make it more effective to demolish a building and build new, unfortunately. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I would love for everyone to just do like a 1-minute wrap up and to hear, I'd love to wrap up with something optimistic. So tell us what you see in the future that's going well about housing that you want to share with us. So if we can head into our holiday week next week and with some hope for the future.
I guess I'll begin. I think it's just, I started as a legislative aide back in 2013, and these conversations weren't happening then. If they were, it was not to this extent where we're talking about it on a daily basis, where there's many organizations, not just in San Mateo County, but around the Bay Area as well. And to the fact that, we have a state that has made policies and investments towards housing, as well as our federal government too, with right now consideration of the Build Back Better Act that could go towards really significant investments towards housing and homelessness. I think, this is an opportunity for all of us to really start to, support one another and come together as a community. And I mean, it's happening not just at the local level, but at the state and federal level.
Absolutely. I mean, if you had told me in 2019 that we would have the state buying up hotels so that people could live in them permanently, I would not have believed you. Like, that is the pace at which that has happened has been so invigorating and encouraging, because it means we can come together and bring solutions at a time when we need to. So that's exciting. I would say the budget was really, really exciting. And I remember Governor Brown one year saying, like, this is the year of housing, but every single year after this also needs to be the year of housing. And so I'm excited to see that that's been true for the most part.
And I would just say, in closing, that Leora had mentioned, Measure K, and I think that really was a demonstration of just what a compassionate community we really are on the peninsula. And we've got great elected officials at the local level who are really wrestling with these challenges of jobs and housing and homelessness. And so we're very fortunate in that case, particularly compared to some other parts of the state. And so we have the electorate that's willing to really support this issue. Now, obviously, there are limits to it, and some people aren't thrilled with all the legislation that's been passed, but there is a lot of good work happening at the local level. And we really need to create safe, decent places for people to live. And I think we can do that with the tools that we've got now. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to our speakers, Michael Lane, Senior Policy Director for SPUR, Irving Torres, Director of Community Engagement for OffHome, Leora Tonwatko, Organizing Director of Housing Leadership Council of San Mateo County, and to Petra Silton and all of our associates at Thrive Alliance for making this very informative program possible. Thank you all so much. As we prepare to say farewell, I think we have just a quick recap of some coming attractions, some events that you can look forward to, and some from the League of Women Voters and also from our good friends at Thrive Alliance. And if you are interested in being part of putting on programs like this, I would encourage you to consider joining the League of Women Voters of North and Central San Mateo County. We are always welcoming new members, and we have lots of interesting work for people to do. So if this sounds like your cup of tea, by all means, visit our website and click the join button. And we have upcoming Thrive events, upcoming League events. So we hope to see all of you again in the near future. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.